There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a military mess hall when something shifts. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of men told to be quiet. Something different. Something that moves through a crowd like a change in air pressure before a storm subtle enough that half the people in the room don't consciously notice it, but felt by every single one of them in the back of the neck, in the chest, in that place behind the sternum, where soldiers keep the part of themselves that never fully stands down. That silence came to the Naval Base Coronado Mess Hall on a Wednesday in November. It came because of one woman, one table, and one moment that none of the men present would fully understand until much later. This is that story. Naval Base Coronado sits on a narrow strip of land just outside San Diego, separated from the city by a thin stretch of San Diego Bay. On a clear morning, you can see the downtown skyline from the beach on the western side of the island, the glass towers catching the early sun, while a mile away, men are already running in the sand before dawn, already in the water, already being tested in the ways that have defined this place for decades. The base is home to the Naval Special Warfare Command, which means it is home to the SEALs, not the SEALs of movies, not the ones with the dramatic slow-motion entries and the perfectly timed one-liners. The real ones. The ones who eat quickly, sleep when they can, and carry a specific kind of tiredness in the eyes that has nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with what they have seen. The ones who have learned to be invisible in plain sight, who can walk through a crowded airport in civilian clothes and look like anyone while carrying in their hands and their training and the back corners of their minds capabilities that most people will never know exist. The mess hall at Coronado was built for function, not comfort. Long metal tables, fluorescent lighting that washed everything in the same flat gray. The smell of coffee that had been sitting too long, and food that was nutritious and plentiful, and exactly as exciting as institutional cooking has ever been. It was loud in the way that mess halls are always loud, the accumulated noise of men who spend most of their professional lives in controlled silence, finally given permission to decompress. The sound of trays of boots on concrete, of stories being told to people who could actually understand them. On this particular Wednesday, SEAL Team 7 occupied the long table near the center of the room. 7 men, various ages, the kind of group that, to an outside eye, might look like any collection of fit, crew-cut military personnel, but that, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, represented an extraordinary concentration of capability and experience. At one end of the table sat Chief Roy Griffith. If you were going to write a paragraph about Roy Griffith, you would start with the wrong things and have to back up. You might start with the physical, the broad shoulders running slightly, to the kind of solid that comes after years of strength training, slowly yielded ground to the passage of time, the close-cropped gray hair, the face that had once been conventionally handsome, and was now something more interesting, scored with lines that each had a story attached. You might start with the career, 29 years of service deployments that spanned 4 decades and more geography than most people see in a lifetime, a chest that on formal occasions would require real estate for the ribbons he had earned and that in daily life he wore without. But you would be starting wrong. The thing that defined Roy Griffith, the thing that anyone who had spent more than an afternoon with him would tell you first, was the quality of his silence. He had the silence of a man who had long ago made peace with knowing things he could not say. Not the silence of someone with secrets burning a hole in their chest. Not the tight-lipped silence of suppressed anger or withheld judgment. Something quieter than that. Something that came from a specific kind of experience. The experience of having been in rooms and situations where everything was at stake, where the wrong word at the wrong moment cost lives, where the only currency that actually mattered was judgment. When you had spent enough time in those rooms, silence stopped being the absence of speech and became something you inhabited, something you wore. Roy Griffith wore his silence the way other men wore their rank. He was 55 years old and he ate his Wednesday lunch with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned over 3 decades that meals were fuel first and pleasure second, and that both were secondary to the ability to move when movement was required. He had been watching the door since he sat down. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone at the table would notice. But the chair he always chose, end of the table back to the wall, clear sight line to the main entrance, was not chosen by accident. None of the choices Roy Griffith made were chosen by accident. That was another thing the years had given him. At the other end of the table, Sergeant Beckett Holt was doing what Beckett Holt did with great enthusiasm and considerable natural talent. He was talking. Beckett was 26 years old, which in SEAL terms meant he was past the early proving stage, but still young enough that the full weight of what he had chosen to do with his life had not settled permanently into his bones. He was from Beaumont, Texas, a fact announced by his accent, which 26 years and several years of elite military service had done absolutely nothing to diminish. He was built like the kind of athlete who had never needed to try particularly hard at being athletic, which had made certain things easy for him and certain other things considerably harder. The things that had been made harder were the invisible ones. Patience. The specific humility that comes from encountering something larger than yourself. The wisdom to distinguish between the courage to move forward and the recklessness of not knowing when to stay still. He was funny, genuinely reliably funny, with the kind of humor that landed because it came from real observation rather than performance. His teammates liked him with the uncomplicated affection that groups of men develop for the member who can break tension at exactly the right moment. He had good instincts in the field. He was not yet finished becoming the person those instincts would eventually produce. Roy Griffith watched him the way a man watches something he recognizes. That was the Wednesday that Beckett Holt was telling a story about a situation from a recent training exercise that had gone sideways in a way that was objectively funny now that everyone was safely on the other side of it and the table was laughing and the mess hall was loud with the ordinary business of a Wednesday lunch at one of the most demanding military installations in the world. That was when the door opened. Roy Griffith stopped chewing. It lasted less than a second. The pause was so small, so precisely controlled, that no one at the table noticed. No one except perhaps Beckett, whose eyes were sharp enough to catch small things even when he did not know what to do with them. Griffith brought his fork back to his plate without changing his expression. Continued eating. Continued nodding at the appropriate moments in Beckett's story. But his attention had moved. The woman who walked in was carrying a standard food tray. She was wearing fatigues, the kind of fatigues that were regulation in their cut and material, but that carried, if you looked at the right places, the ghost of something that had been removed. Where a name tag should have been a small rectangle of slightly different colored fabric. Where unit insignia would normally sit the same careful absence. Not a person who had forgotten to put on their identification. Not a person whose tags were lost or being replaced. Something deliberate. Something intentional. She was somewhere in her late 30s, though it was the kind of age that was hard to pin down precisely because the face was controlled in a way that gave very little away. Not a controlled face in the plastic sense, not the blank expression of someone performing neutrality. The face of someone who had learned to carry a great deal without it showing and had been carrying it long enough that the skill was no longer effort. It was simply the way she was. She stood at the entrance for approximately 3 seconds before moving to the food counter. In those 3 seconds, she did something that Roy Griffith recognized with the particular clarity of a man who had done the same thing in the same kind of rooms for 30 years. She read the room, not casually, not the way a person glances around to find where their friends are sitting. The eyes moved in a pattern, entrance points, exit points, the arrangement of tables relative to each other, the distribution and posture of the people present. It took 3 seconds. It was complete. It was the room reading of someone who had spent years in environments where the information gathered in those first seconds was the information that kept you alive. Then she moved to the counter, made her selections without lingering, and carried her tray to a table along the far wall. Table 7, the table that had the most direct sight line to the main door. The table with solid wall on 3 sides. The table that no one sat at by preference because it was slightly too far from the main group, slightly too isolated. She sat down with her back to the wall. Roy Griffith looked at his plate, continued eating. The narrator of any good story about the United States military has to pause here and say something about the era that shaped Roy Griffith, because without it, the rest of this story does not land the way it should. He came up in the Gulf War years. Not the sanitized, short version Gulf War of highlight reels and victory parades, but the full experience of it, the buildup, the fear, the waiting that military people know is often worse than the action itself, the specific surreal quality of a conflict that was the first of its kind in terms of media coverage and the last of its kind in several other ways that took years to understand. He had been 22 years old when Desert Storm ended. He had already seen enough to know that the world did not operate the way it was described in any document he had ever been handed. Men of that generation, men who came up through the post-Vietnam Cold War, Gulf War years of American military service, developed a particular relationship with what they knew and what they said. They had watched the country struggle and argue and grieve. They had been formed in the long shadow of that struggle. They had learned in ways both taught and absorbed that some knowledge was a weight you carried without putting it down, without handing it to anyone who had not earned the right to hold it. They were the keepers of things. The loudest people in the room, Roy Griffith had learned early and confirmed over 30 years, were almost never the ones who had seen the most. The ones who had seen the most usually had a specific quality of stillness. You recognized it if you knew what to look for. It was the stillness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone in the room because they had already proven it in rooms that no one in this room would ever enter. He had seen it in 3 people over the course of his career, in the way you see something rare that stays with you. The first had been a sergeant in his early deployment, a man in his 50s then, who had served in 2 previous conflicts and who could stop a situation from escalating simply by walking into it. The second had been a commander he worked under in the late 90s, a man of extraordinary quiet authority, who turned out after he retired to have been involved in operations that Griffith only learned about through briefings that were themselves classified at a level most people never reach. The third was the woman sitting at table 7. He had met her in different circumstances. He had not expected to see her here. He had not expected to see her anywhere, because the nature of what she did and who she was meant that her appearances were deliberate and uncommon, and when she appeared somewhere, there was always a reason, and the reason was never small. He did not allow himself to react beyond that first half-second pause. He continued eating. He waited. Across the mess hall, Beckett Holt had wrapped up his story to appreciative laughter and was settling into the comfortable afterglow of a well-landed joke. He was reaching for his coffee when his eyes drifted, as young men's eyes do, across the room. He saw her. He looked away, looked back. She was eating alone. Clean uniform, no insignia, no name tag. Table in the corner, not looking up. Beckett Holt was 26 years old and had been tested and trained to the edge of human physical and mental capability, and there was one thing his training had not yet fully addressed. He did not like not knowing who was in his room. It was not a thought he would have been able to articulate precisely. It was not arrogance exactly, not the conscious kind anyway. It was something more instinctive than that. A low-grade discomfort with an unknown variable in his immediate environment. A need not fully examined to establish the coordinates of everyone present. In the field, that instinct was a survival skill. In the mess hall of his home base, it was something else, something that had not yet been refined into wisdom. He watched her for a moment. She cut her food precisely, placed her fork down between bites at the same angle each time, and did not look up. The table in the far corner, the careful absence where her name should be, the way she had walked in and read the room before she moved toward the food counter. Beckett leaned over to the man beside him and grinned the grin that his teammates had learned to recognize as the preface to something that would either be funny or inadvisable and was sometimes both simultaneously. "Watch this," he said. Roy Griffith at the other end of the table heard those 2 words clearly. He did not look up. He set his fork down very slowly and looked at his plate with the expression of a man watching something happen that he cannot stop and has already accepted he cannot stop. Beckett crossed the mess hall with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that a situation might not go the way he expected. He dropped his tray on the table across from her with a sound that was slightly too loud, a sound that was in its way its own announcement, and sat down with the smile that usually worked. "Well, well," he said, loud enough that a few nearby tables could hear. "We've got a mystery soldier." She did not look up. "What's your rank, sweetheart?" There are 7 words in that sentence, and the one that determined everything was the last one. Not because it was the worst word he could have chosen, because it was the most revealing. It told her and anyone paying attention exactly what Beckett Holt believed about who was sitting across from him. It told her what category he had placed her in before he sat down. It told her with the efficient eloquence of a single mislaid word that he was 26 years old and had not yet been taught to look properly. She finished the bite she was chewing, set her fork down, looked up, classified. The word landed with a flatness that was its own kind of weight. Not hostile, not defensive. The word of someone who was not performing a response but simply answering a question with the accurate answer. Beckett's smile held, but something flickered behind it. He had expected something else. He had expected the response of someone caught, off balance by the approach, someone who would either engage on his terms or decline in a way he could work with. He had not expected that single flat word delivered without affect the way a person reads a road sign. He recalibrated, leaned in slightly. "Classified," he said. "What are you, CIA?" Her eyes were gray. The particular gray of overcast coastal sky. They did not move from his. Higher. The laughter that had followed Beckett across the room, the ambient hum of his teammates watching with the fond expectation of being entertained, Shifted pitch. Not gone, but lower. A few men at neighboring tables had stopped their own conversations. Higher than C, IA, Beckett said, and now the confidence in his voice had the thinnest layer of something else underneath it, so thin he could not have named it. You the president? She leaned forward slightly, just an inch or two. When she spoke, her voice had not changed volume or tone from the first words she had said to him. No, but I briefed them. The mess hall went quiet, not all at once. Like a sound being turned down on a dial, the conversations nearest to table 7, stopping first, then the ones adjacent to those, then the ones adjacent to those, until the only sounds in the room were the ambient, mechanical noise of the kitchen and the distant bass activity coming through the walls. Roy Griffith at the far end of the long center table was still looking at his plate. He had stopped eating. Beckett Holt was not a man who lost his footing easily. That was one of the things that made him good at what he did. He had been through training processes designed by people who had spent careers learning the most efficient ways to find a person's limits, and he had come through it with his fundamental nature intact. He was not easily rattled. But there is a specific experience. Any man over 60 watching this will know exactly what is being described when you reach for the solid ground you have always found beneath you and discover with a physical sensation not unlike missing a step in the dark that the ground is somewhere other than where you expected it to be. He was reaching for his solid ground. He was finding it was somewhere else. You briefed the president, he said. The question mark was not quite in his voice, which was the interesting thing. It came out with the cadence of a statement because some part of him was no longer asking, was instead processing, reorganizing, running a rapid internal inventory of every assumption he had carried across the room and setting them down one by one. She gave him a small smile, the first change in her expression since he sat down. The smile of someone who has been in this particular moment before, many times from many different directions, and has long since stopped needing it to go any particular way. Among others. Then the mess hall door opened. Admiral Garrett Webb was 58 years old and had spent 34 of those years earning the right to walk into a room the way he walked into rooms. He was tall, which helped, but the authority was not physical. It came from somewhere else. It came from the specific quality of a man who had made decisions, consequential, irreversible decisions, the kind where the wrong choice cost people their lives and the right choice cost you something else, and had found over decades that he could make them. Not without cost, not without the weight that accumulated over time like scar tissue, but he could make them. That knowledge had settled into him and become the architecture of how he carried himself. Every person in the mess hall stood. This was not unusual. This was protocol. The room going to attention when flag officers entered was as automatic as breathing for the people in this building. What was not automatic was what happened next. Webb scanned the room with the efficient survey of a man accustomed to reading spaces quickly. His eyes moved across the standing personnel, across the tables, across the kitchen entrance, and then they found the far corner. Table 7, the woman sitting with her back to the wall. His posture changed. It was a small change visible only to someone watching for it or someone who had learned to read the specific language of military bearing. A slight straightening, a shift in the alignment of the shoulders. The almost imperceptible adjustment that happens when the body's hierarchy recognition registers someone and recalibrates accordingly. He walked directly to table 7. The room stayed standing technically at attention, but with the collective awareness turned entirely toward what was happening in the corner. Because this was not how Admiral Webb moved through a mess hall. He moved through and acknowledged, or he moved through with the purposeful distraction of a man with somewhere else to be. He did not change direction mid-room and go specifically to someone. He stopped in front of table 7. He saluted, sharp, clean, unambiguous. The salute of a senior officer to someone of higher authority, executed with a precision that made it unmistakably deliberate. Ma'am, I wasn't aware you'd arrived on base. My apologies. The mess hall did not breathe. Beckett Holt, still sitting across from her, experienced a sensation he would later describe to Roy Griffith as the floor tilting. Not metaphorically, an actual physical sensation of the horizontal surface beneath him becoming unreliable. The woman at table 7 returned the salute with the ease of someone who had returned a great many salutes over a great many years, just passing through Admiral. I needed a quiet meal. Webb nodded precisely once with the respect of a man acknowledging a preference that was to be honored without question. Of course, Commander Cole. Anything you need. He turned and walked out of the mess hall. The door closed. The room remained standing. In the silence that followed, you could hear things that the ambient noise of the mess hall usually covered the mechanical hum of the ventilation system. The distant sound of a vehicle crossing the base, the small sounds of a large room full of people who had collectively stopped making any sound at all. Commander Cole looked at Beckett Holt. Beckett Holt looked at Commander Cole. She picked up her fork, cut a precise bite, set the fork back down at its usual angle. When she spoke, her voice was the same volume it had been at the beginning of the conversation. Next time you ask someone their rank, she said, make sure you're cleared to hear the answer. She stood, lifted her tray with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose time belongs entirely to herself. And she walked out of the mess hall with the same quality of movement she had walked in with, the movement of someone who does not need the room to watch her and therefore does not concern herself with whether it does. Every pair of eyes in the room followed her to the door. The door closed. The room stood in silence for a moment longer. Then slowly, piece by piece, like a machine remembering how to run, the mess hall resumed. Trays moved. Conversations started in lowered voices in the uncertain register of people trying to process something. At the center table, Beckett Holt walked back to his seat and sat down. He did not say anything. This was for people who knew him remarkable. Roy Griffith picked up his fork and resumed eating. He did not look at Beckett. He did not say anything. But Beckett, sitting down across from him, looked up at the older man's face and saw something there that he had never seen in the 26 years of looking at faces. Not surprise, not shock, something specific and quiet that it would take him weeks to find the right word for. He would eventually land on the word recognition. Griffith ate his food methodically. Then, without looking up, without changing his tone from the tone he might use to comment on the weather or the quality of the coffee, he said 5 words. Finish your food, son. Beckett looked at him, looked at the door that Commander Cole had walked out of, looked back at Griffith. You knew, he said. It was not a question. Griffith did not answer. He continued eating with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned that most of the questions people thought were urgent were questions that could wait, and that the answers to the ones that could not wait usually arrived on their own schedule regardless. Later, after the meal, after the room had fully returned to its ordinary operations, Beckett went back to his quarters and opened his laptop and navigated to the internal network. He entered her name in the search field. There was a file. He clicked to open it. The screen displayed 4 words and a designation that he had to read twice to be sure he was reading correctly. Access denied. Authorization level above top secret. SAP. He sat back in his chair. SAP, Special Access Program. The designation that existed above top secret for operations and personnel whose very existence was considered a national security matter. The kind of designation that you could serve an entire career in the United States military and never have reason to encounter. The kind that meant the information was not merely classified from the general public or from unauthorized personnel or from people without sufficient clearance. It meant the information was classified from almost everyone. He closed the laptop. He sat in the afternoon light of his quarters for a while and thought about the distance between the word sweetheart and the designation SAP, and the fact that the distance was so large it was essentially not measurable. That the distance had existed before he walked across the mess hall and had not changed based on whether he knew about it. At the far end of the mess hall table, 7 sat empty against the wall. The chair pushed neatly in, the sight lines clear to the door. No indication that anyone had been sitting there except for the fact that in a room full of military personnel resuming normal lunch operations, not one person moved toward that particular table. No one sat down. There are rooms you walk out of the same as you walked in. This was not one of them. The afternoon that followed the meal was the kind of San Diego afternoon that the rest of the country envies without fully understanding. Clear sky temperature in the low 70s, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was photographed rather than lived in. The base ran its ordinary Wednesday operations. Vehicles crossed the grounds on their regular routes. Personnel moved between buildings with the purposeful efficiency of people whose time is organized for them. Beckett Holt walked back to his quarters building with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is not coming out right. He had been in the Navy for 6 years. He had been a SEAL for 3. He had operated in environments where the rules of ordinary human behavior were suspended, where the coordinates of reality were determined by conditions that most people would not survive. He thought of himself with reasonable accuracy as someone who was hard to knock off balance. He was currently off balance. Not in the physical sense. His stride was even. His shoulders were squared. Anyone observing him would have seen a young sergeant walking across a base on a Wednesday afternoon. What they would not have seen was the interior work happening behind the unremarkable exterior, the specific kind of processing that happens when a person's model of a situation turns out to be wrong in ways they had not anticipated. He had walked across that mess hall with a picture in his head. The picture had been wrong. That was not in itself the part that was working on him. Being wrong about things was a condition of being alive, and the character of what he did meant he had learned to update quickly when the situation changed. The part that was working on him was a more precise question. The question was, how had he been so wrong? He had looked at a woman with no insignia and no name tag sitting alone at a corner table and had made a set of assumptions so automatic that he had not even recognized them as assumptions. He had acted on those assumptions with complete confidence. He had been in front of his entire team and a room full of the people he worked with comprehensively and publicly corrected, not by argument, not by confrontation, not by anyone explaining what he had gotten wrong. Simply by the presentation of the truth which had turned out to be so far from his assumptions that the distance between them was almost geometric. He was 26 years old and trying to figure out when exactly he had stopped noticing the assumptions he was making. That was the real question, not the surface one about who Commander Cole was, the interior one about what it said about him that he had walked into that situation so thoroughly certain. He started with the most straightforward approach, asking people. He asked 3 officers he trusted. The first changed the subject so fluidly that Beckett could not identify the exact moment the transition happened. One second the conversation was about Commander Cole, and the next it was about the Thursday briefing schedule. The second officer listened with a face that became carefully neutral in the way that faces become careful when they are being very deliberate about not reacting, then said he did not have information that would be useful. The third, a lieutenant colonel with 22 years of service, and the kind of direct manner Beckett had always respected, looked at him for a moment after the question and said something Beckett wrote down afterward. "Son," he said, "there are questions where the asking tells you more than the answering would. Stop asking." He stopped asking. He stood in the courtyard between 2 buildings in the afternoon light and understood that he had hit the edge of what his clearance and his rank allowed him to know. That edge was real, and it was not moving. He had encountered classified information before, had operated within the boundaries of need to know. His entire career had understood intellectually that the architecture of what he did not know was at least as large as the architecture of what he did. But understanding it intellectually and standing directly against the wall of it were different experiences. He found Roy Griffith at 1600 hours on the western edge of the base grounds, on a paved path that ran along a fence line offering through the chain link and across a stretch of sand a clear view of the Pacific. Griffith was standing with a cup of coffee in both hands, looking at the water in the posture of a man who has given himself permission to be nowhere in particular for a few minutes. He did not seem surprised when Beckett appeared beside him. They stood in silence for a moment. This was the kind of silence that Griffith was comfortable in, and that Beckett was still learning to inhabit the silence of 2 people occupying the same space without needing to fill it. The Pacific was doing what the Pacific does in the late afternoon, moving, catching the sun at angles that turned the surface alternately silver and dark. The horizon was clean and distant in the way that large bodies of water are not hostile, just operating at a scale that has nothing to do with human concerns. "You knew who she was," Beckett said. It was not this time a question. Griffith looked at the water. "Yes," he said. "From before today. Yes." Beckett waited. One of the things he had learned from Roy Griffith over the time they had served together was that with certain people pushing for more was counterproductive. Some things arrived on their own schedule or not at all. You created the conditions and then you waited. He waited. Griffith drank from his coffee, looked at the horizon. The lines in his face were deep in the low afternoon light, each one with its own particular story that Beckett knew he would never hear in full. "Eastern Europe," Griffith said, 2019. You would have been 21 years old. Beckett said nothing. He had been 21 in 2019. He had been in the middle of the training that would lead to his qualification, fully absorbed in his own becoming. "I was in a building for 11 days, Griffith said. The building was in a city whose name I am not going to tell you because I was briefed not to, and that briefing still stands. There were 2 other men with me. We were not tourists." Beckett understood this. He did not say so. On the 11th day, Griffith continued at approximately 3 in the morning. The door opened. He stopped. He looked at his coffee, then at the water. She was standing in the doorway. Not one of her team first, not a signal, not a warning, her. She had come through whatever she had come through to get to that door, and she was standing in it, and she looked at the 3 of us, and she said one word. He paused. "Move." The word sat in the air between them. "That was it," Griffith said. "Not we're here to rescue you, not you're safe, Not any of the things you might expect. One word. And we moved. Because you would have. If you had seen her standing in that doorway at 3 in the morning on the 11th day, you would not have asked any questions. You would have moved. The Pacific moved in front of them. A container ship was visible on the horizon, traveling north, enormous at that distance, and somehow dwarfed by the scale of the water it sat on. She was 31 years old, Griffith said. Beckett absorbed this. 31. She was leading a joint operation at 31, Griffith said, with the specific tone of someone stating a fact whose implications they are allowing the listener to work out independently. Not because she had the seniority, not because she had the years, because there was no one else who could read what needed to be read to make that operation work. The terrain, the people, the moving pieces of a situation that did not stay still long enough for anyone who needed to think it through. She had been doing what she does since she was 22 years old. She had 9 years of learning that nobody else had at that level. He finished his coffee. She didn't get there the way people usually get places, he said. She got there because the alternative was sending someone who would not bring those men home. Beckett looked at his own hands. He thought about the word sweetheart and the 4 words on his laptop screen and the distance between them and how that distance had existed before he walked across the mess hall and had not changed based on whether he knew about it. You never told anyone, he said. Griffith looked at the water. The operation has never been officially acknowledged, he said, which means I have never officially been in that building, and she has never officially been in that doorway. That is not a complaint. That is how it works. You know how it works. Beckett knew how it worked. Did you ever? He started. No, Griffith said. Before Beckett could finish the sentence, there was a moment of quiet. In this line of work, Griffith said, gratitude is carried. You don't put it down in front of people. You don't make someone stand there while you try to hand it to them. You take it with you and you make sure you were worth the mission. That's the only thing you can actually do with it. He said this without sentiment. He said it the way a man states a fact that has been true for long enough that it has become simply the way things are. But underneath the flatness of the delivery, Beckett heard something he recognized as weight. The specific weight of something carried for years in the manner Griffith was describing, held close, held privately, never put down. Beckett thought about men he had known from an older generation. His grandfather, who had served in the Army in the early 70s, and who had carried the things he carried with a silence so complete that Beckett had not known until after the old man's death what some of those things actually were. His father's commanding officer from a reunion he had attended as a teenager, a man in his 60s then, who had shaken hands across a hotel ballroom with the specific economy of someone for whom emotion was real, but public expression of it was a language he did not speak. There was a whole generation of American men who had been formed in circumstances that taught them to carry without complaint and to hold without surrender, and who had done exactly that across the full length of their lives. You could argue about whether this was entirely healthy. You could argue about what it cost them. But you could not argue that they had not held what they were given. Roy Griffith was one of them. She didn't have to come here, Griffith said. Beckett looked at him. Coronado, Griffith said. She could have gone anywhere. She has the kind of latitude that most people in uniform never get close to. She chose this base. He let that sit. He did not say why. He did not speculate out loud. He stated the fact and allowed the silence around it to carry whatever weight it was going to carry. Beckett stood beside him and looked at the Pacific and turned this information over, not rushing toward a conclusion, not filing it in a category and moving on, but holding it and looking at it from different angles and being willing to not yet understand what it meant. After a while, Griffith said, "You're going to want to apologize." Beckett said nothing. "Do it once," Griffith said. "Do it clean. Don't explain it or justify it or dress it up. Say what you need to say and then stop talking." He turned from the fence and walked back toward the main base buildings with the same unhurried directness with which he did everything. He did not look back. Beckett stood at the fence line alone with the Pacific in front of him and thought about a woman he had spoken 8 careless words to over a lunch tray who had led a covert extraction operation in Eastern Europe at 31 years old, who had a file on every person on this base, who had sat with her back to the wall because that was 17 years of habit, and not a choice, who had looked at him with gray eyes and said 4 words that were technically classified intelligence, and that had, in the moment, landed exactly the way she intended. He thought about what Griffith had said about how she got to where she was, not by seniority, not by years, because there was no one else. There is a particular kind of reckoning that happens to people in their mid-20s if they are lucky and paying sufficient attention. It does not arrive with music or ceremony. It arrives the way the tide arrives, incrementally from a direction you are not fully watching, and by the time you notice it, you are already standing in it. Beckett Holt was standing in it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the base, in a small office in one of the administrative buildings on the western side of the grounds, Commander Mara Cole was doing what she did. Not the classified parts, simply working. Documents on the desk organized with the precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is and can locate any piece of it without searching. A cup of coffee barely touched that had gone cold. The particular stillness that a room acquires when the person inside it has been still in it long enough that the room has adapted to them. She was reading something. Her eyes moved across the page with the focus of someone for whom reading documents was not a passive activity, but a form of analysis, not taking in words, but extracting information, weighing it, placing it in the architecture of everything else she knew. On the corner of the desk, a photograph lay face down. She did not turn it over. She never turned it over while she was working. That was the arrangement she had made with it. It could be present, but it could not be in front of her. Some things you carried behind you rather than in your hands. That did not mean you had put them down. It meant you had found the position that allowed you to keep moving. Her right hand rested on the desk beside the document. In the low light of the office against the pale surface of the desk, the scar on her right wrist was visible. Small, old, faded to the color that old scars acquire when they have fully healed and been lived with long enough to become simply part of the topography of a person. Not a dramatic scar, not the kind that arrives with a story anyone would tell in a mess hall, just the mark of something that had happened and been absorbed and become part of the permanent record of her body, a record that was in its way as accurate as any file and considerably more honest. She had been doing this, some version of this, in some office, in some building, in some part of the world that required what she could do for 17 years. She had been 21 when she started, younger than Beckett Holt was now. She had eaten alone at more tables than she could count in those 17 years. Not because she was incapable of the ordinary human business of sitting with people. She had the social fluency that comes from years of operating in environments where reading people and adapting to them is operational necessity. She could sit in any room and be whatever the room required. She ate alone because eating alone was honest, because the version of herself that sat with her back to the wall and scanned the room on entry and placed her fork at the same angle after each use was the actual version. Not a performance, not a carefully maintained posture. The real shape of who she had become after 17 years of being exactly this. She had been 31 years old in a doorway in a city she was not officially in, leading an operation that was not officially happening, and she had said one word and 3 men had moved. She had been 22 when she was first deployed to an environment where the ordinary rules of what was safe and what was not were suspended entirely. She had been 25 when she made the first decision she would carry for the rest of her life, the right decision, the one that brought everyone home, the one that cost her something she did not yet have a name for, and that she eventually stopped trying to name. 17 years. She still ate alone. She turned the page. She did not think about the young sergeant who had asked her rank in the mess hall. That was not because it was beneath notice. It was because she had already done with it what she did with information, processed it, filed it in the appropriate place, extracted what was relevant, and set aside what was not. What was relevant was what she had seen after Webb walked out. Not the arrogance of the approach, not the word sweetheart, which she had heard variants of in enough rooms over enough years that it registered now only as data about the person saying it, not the predictable moment of recognition when the room understood who she was. What she had seen was the 2 seconds after, the way his face had changed, not the obvious surface embarrassment. Underneath it, in the 2 seconds when he was not yet performing a reaction because he had not yet had time to decide what the reaction should be, she had seen something specific, the beginning of an actual question. Not what is your rank, a real question, the kind that does not arrive with words because it has not yet found its words, the kind that a person carries quietly for a while before they know what it is. She had been watching for that. She turned another page. The Pacific was visible through the small office window, moving at a scale that had nothing to do with human concerns. She looked at it for a moment, then back at the document. The work did not stop. It had not stopped in 17 years. Across the base, Beckett Holt turned from the fence line and walked back toward the main buildings. He did not have a plan. He did not know how to locate a woman whose file he could not access and whose whereabouts he had no way of knowing. He knew 2 things. He knew that he needed to say something in the specific clean way that Griffith had described. Once clear and then stop talking. And he knew that whatever she had seen in his face in those 2 seconds after Webb walked out, whatever had made her pause at his shoulder on the way out and deliver those words instead of simply leaving, it wasn't something he yet understood. Understanding it was going to require him to become in some way he could not yet specify different from who he had been when he walked across the mess hall with his teammates watching and the words "watch this" still in the air behind him. He walked back into the base. The mess hall when he passed the building was empty at this hour, the cleaning cycle running the fluorescent lights bright and indifferent over the long metal tables. The far corner where table 7 sat against the wall chair, pushed neatly in the room's geometry, unchanged the sight lines clear to the door. Empty and somehow not empty. The way that rooms are not empty when what happened in them has not finished happening. He did not go in. He kept walking. He found her the next morning, not through any particular skill of investigation or tracking. He found her because she was standing outside the small administrative building on the western side of the base at 0630, drinking coffee and looking at the horizon in the way of someone who has already been awake for several hours and is using the open sky not for the view, but for the quality of space it provides to a mind that has been working in closed rooms. He almost walked past. He had been on his morning run, the same route he ran every day, the one that took him along the perimeter road and back through the administrative quad, and he came around the corner of the building, and there she was 15 feet away, and there was no version of continuing in any direction that did not involve acknowledging that he had seen her and she had seen him. She looked at him with the gray eyes that gave nothing away and waited with the patience of someone who has no particular investment in how the next 30 seconds go. He stopped. He stood in front of her in his running clothes with the morning light coming in flat and clean from the east, and he said what he had decided to say in the way Griffith had described. "Commander Cole, I was out of line yesterday. I'm sorry." He stopped talking. This was harder than it sounded. The natural momentum of an apology is to keep going, to fill the silence that follows it with explanation and context and the implicit request for absolution. The impulse is almost physical, the discomfort of having said the necessary thing and then standing in the silence it creates without softening it. He had decided to stop. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." There was a low concrete wall running along the side of the building, the kind of utilitarian architecture that military installations produce in abundance. She sat on it. He sat beside her with enough space between them to be respectful and close enough to be a conversation. She held her coffee in both hands and looked at the middle distance for a moment in the way of someone deciding not whether to speak, but how. "You walked over to that table," she said, "because you needed the room to know you weren't afraid of anything." He did not deny this. "I understand that," she said. "I used to do the same thing." He looked at her. There was something in the specific past tense of it, the used to, that opened a door he had not expected. "Used to," he said. She looked at her coffee. "Until the first time it got someone killed." She said it the way you say a fact that has been true long enough to lose its sharp edges, not because the weight of it has diminished, but because you have been carrying it long enough that the carrying has become simply the condition of your existence. Not performance, not an invitation to respond, just the truth stated in the same register you might use to describe the weather. He did not say he was sorry. Saying he was sorry would have been wrong. It would have been making her truth about his comfort with her truth, which was the kind of response she had been getting from people her entire career, and which she did not need more of. He stayed quiet. She looked at the eastern light for a moment. The base was beginning its morning operations around them, the ordinary machinery of a military installation resuming itself after the pause of the night. There is a thing that happens to people who have been in the kind of rooms Mara Cole had been in for 17 years. It is not a dramatic thing. It is not visible in the way that movies suggest visible damage looks. It is quieter than that and more permanent, a specific reorganization of priorities that happens so gradually and so completely that by the time you notice it, it has been true for years. The ordinary world does not stop making sense. The ordinary things do not stop having value. You do not become incapable of sitting beside another human being on a concrete wall and drinking coffee in the morning light. What changes is the interior relationship to all of it. Everything becomes very clear and very specific. Not precious, the opposite of precious. Just real in the way that things are real when you have been in enough situations where the distinction between real and not real was the distinction between living and not living. You stop performing, not because you decide to stop, Because after enough time, the performance is more effort than it is worth, and you have learned to use your effort only on things that matter. She had stopped performing a long time ago. This was among other things why she ate alone. You read every file on this base before you arrived, he said. Yes, she said. He thought about this. 47 people. Files that would have included service records, performance evaluations, deployment histories, psychological assessments. She had read all of it before she sat down in that mess hall. Why this base, he said. She looked at him. Griffith already told you I chose it deliberately. He didn't tell me why. She considered this not the weighing of whether to trust him with the information, but the selection of the right form for what she was going to say. Because of what's here, she said. Not the location, not the facilities. She paused. The specific combination of people. He waited. There is work coming, she said. The kind that requires a specific set of people built in a specific way. Not just technically capable, that's a threshold, not a distinction. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The kind of people who have been tested to the point where you know what they actually are, not just what they perform as. He understood that she was not going to tell him the specifics of the work. What he was trying to understand was the edge of what she was telling him, and that edge was becoming clearer. You were evaluating, he said. She did not confirm or deny this directly. She said, when I walked into that mess hall, I had already read 47 files. I already knew a great deal about the people in that room. Then why he started. Because she said a file tells you what a person has done. It tells you the record of their performance and the arc of their career, and the assessments of people who have watched them from above. It tells you quite a lot. She looked at him directly. It does not tell you what a person does when they're surprised, when they're wrong, when the ground moves under them and they have about 2 seconds before they have to decide who they actually are. The morning light was fully up now, the early flatness giving way to the ordinary light of a California morning, the shadows shortening the base coming into its full operational rhythm. Beckett thought about the 2 seconds after Webb walked out. The moment when he had not yet decided what to feel and was therefore feeling all of it at once, the embarrassment, the disorientation, the specific dizzying quality of discovering that the map was wrong. He had thought that was the worst moment, the most exposed. She had been watching it like a diagnostic, not to humiliate him, not to measure the damage, to see what was underneath the performance when the performance had nothing to stand on. What did you see, he asked. She stood up from the wall, set her coffee down on it. The gesture was so ordinary, the cup placed with the same precise angle as her fork the day before, the same habitual exactness that he now understood was not a quirk, but a record. 17 years of environments where the control of small things was the only control available. So you held it because you held what you could. She looked at him. The beginning of an actual question, she said. Not what's your rank, something real. She picked up her coffee. Something worth seeing. She walked toward the building door. Then she stopped the way she had stopped at his shoulder in the mess hall. She turned back slightly, not fully facing him. My file on you goes back 3 years, she said. Your record is strong. Your evaluations are consistent. Your team says things about you that are worth saying. She paused. None of that is why I'm talking to you right now. The door opened and she went inside. He sat on the concrete wall in the morning light for a while after she left. The base moved around him. A vehicle crossed the far end of the grounds. 2 figures jogged past on the perimeter road. The Pacific was not visible from here, but he could feel the direction of it, a presence in the air, a quality of the light. He thought about what she had said about the first time it got someone killed. He had been in situations with consequences. He had made decisions under conditions of incomplete information and moving variables, and some had been right, and some had been marginal, and all had been made to the best of his ability at the time. He understood intellectually the weight of decisions made in situations that did not permit good options. But there was a kind of understanding that comes from the body rather than the mind. The kind that arrives not through reasoning, but through experience, through actually having made the decision that could not be taken back, through having carried the result through every subsequent day as a permanent part of the architecture of who you were. That understanding was different from the intellectual kind in the way that swimming is different from reading about water. He did not have that understanding yet. He was beginning to understand that he did not have it. This was, he realized, the beginning of the question she had seen in his face. Not the surface question about her rank or her authority, the interior question, the one that did not have words yet, but was organizing itself toward words. The question about the distance between who he was performing as and who he actually was, and what it would take to close that distance, and what it would cost, and whether he was willing to pay it. He got up from the wall and went back to his quarters. He did not see her again that day. He did not see Griffith either, which in retrospect was its own kind of information. Griffith had a way of being present when something was happening that required what he had to offer, and equally present by absence when the work was something a person needed to do alone. Beckett had worked with him long enough to know this was not accidental. The second day passed. The third. The base ran its operations. The team ran their training iterations. Life at Coronado resumed the texture of its ordinary days. He saw her twice in those 2 days, once crossing the grounds in the direction of the administrative buildings, once at the far end of the mess hall, at the same corner table eating alone. Both times he did not approach. Both times he registered her presence the way you register something that has reorganized the space around it simply by being in it. On the third evening, Griffith found him. They walked to the western edge of the grounds again, the fence line, the Pacific visible beyond it in the late light. The sun was going down, doing its California thing with the colors, the pinks and oranges, that in any other part of the country would seem excessive, and that here seemed simply accurate. Griffith stood looking at the water for a moment. "She's leaving tomorrow," he said. Beckett said nothing, early, before the base is fully operational. He understood what Griffith was telling him, not as instructions, as information that he could do with what he decided to do with it. They stood without speaking. The sun continued its work on the horizon. Beckett said. The older man looked at him. "What?" she said. "About the first time." He stopped. "How do you carry that?" Griffith looked at the water for a long moment, long enough that Beckett thought the question might not be one he was going to answer. Then he said, "You don't put it down. Ever. You carry it and you do the next thing right because of it. Not in spite of it. Because of it." He paused. "The carrying is not the punishment," he said. "The carrying is the point." He said this in the same flat factual tone he used for everything, the tone that had been stripped of sentiment by decades of situations that required the real thing rather than the performed version of it. But underneath the flatness, Beckett heard the weight of a man who had been carrying for a long time and knew exactly what he was talking about. "That's what she does," Griffith said. "Every day. She carries it, and she does the next thing right because of it." He turned from the water. "Get some sleep," he said. He walked back toward the buildings. Beckett stood at the fence line alone. The last of the sun was going the sky, moving through the colors that came after the orange and pink, the deeper blues that arrived when the show was over, and what remained was just the sky becoming what it was. He stood in it and thought about carrying things and doing the next right thing, and whether those were two separate actions, or when you had been doing it long enough, the same action. He thought about a woman who had been 21 years old when she started doing work that most people never do, who had been 31 in a doorway in a city she was not officially in, who ate alone not because she was incapable of anything else, but because the alone was honest, who had a scar on her wrist from something she did not explain, and a photograph on her desk with its face turned down, and 17 years of continuous present tense work that did not pause because you had finished one part of it. He set his alarm for 05:30. The morning came the way mornings came on the California coast in November, gray. First the sky withholding the sun's color until the last possible moment, the light arriving gradually as something functional rather than beautiful, the kind of light that does not ask to be admired but simply makes it possible to see. He was at the administrative building by 05:45. She was already outside. Not waiting for him, she could not have been waiting for him because he had told no one, and there was no reason she would have expected him. She was simply there in the manner of someone who was always already at the next thing. The coffee in her hands, the packed bag leaning against the wall beside her. Ready. She looked at him when he came around the corner. She did not look surprised. She did not look unsurprised. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had given nothing away from the beginning, and that he was beginning to understand did not give nothing away because they were hiding things, but because they were looking at whatever was in front of them with complete accuracy and no editorial. He stood in front of her. He had been in this position before, standing in front of someone with something to say and the words not yet fully formed. This was different because he was not performing the process. He was just in it. She waited with the patience that was not a performance of patience, but simply what she was. She had nowhere to be for the next few minutes. That was more important than this. That was not sentimentality. It was the specific allocation of her attention, given completely, which was the only way she gave anything. "I've been trying to understand," he said, "what I was actually doing when I walked across that mess hall." She waited, not just what I thought I was doing. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, then back at her. What I was actually doing. He paused. I think I needed the room to need me to do it, he said. Not to be impressive, to be necessary. And you were sitting alone and you didn't need anything from anyone in there. And I think that was the thing I couldn't sit with. He stopped. She looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. That's the first honest thing you've said to me, she said. He held this. She looked at her coffee. When she looked back up, something in her face had shifted by a degree so small it was almost imperceptible, the specific adjustment of someone deciding that the room has earned a small, additional truth. I sat at table 7 for the same reason, she said. He looked at her. Not in the beginning, she said. In the beginning, I sat there because of the sight lines, because of the exits, because it was tactically the correct position. She paused. After about 4 years, it stopped being a decision. She looked at the eastern horizon where the light was beginning its argument with the gray. There was a night, she said, early in my career. I was 24 years old and I was in a room with people who needed me to have answers, and I had the answers and I gave them, and the operation went correctly and everyone came home. She paused, and I sat in the debrief afterward, and someone looked at me and said, good work, and I understood in that moment that I had wanted them to say it, that I had needed the room to acknowledge me. He waited. A year later, she said there was another room. Different situation. I had the answers again and I gave them, and the operation went correctly. And in the debrief, someone said the same thing. And I realized I didn't care whether they said it or not. She looked at the horizon. Not because I'd stopped caring about the work, she said, because I'd started doing the work for the work, not for the room. He heard this and understood it in the way that you understand things that name something you have been circling without being able to find the words for. The distance between the performance of capability and the actual practice of it, between needing the room to witness and simply doing the thing that needed doing. She picked up her bag, the thing you saw in the doorway, he said, after Webb left. She looked at him. You said it was the beginning of a question. He met her eyes. What was the question? She studied him for a moment. Then she said whether you were becoming someone who would eventually be able to sit at that table and not need anything from the room. She said it without judgment, without the suggestion that the answer was yes or no, or that she had made a determination. She said it the way she said everything, as the accurate description of the thing delivered without decoration. He stood in the morning light and took this in. It was not a comfortable thing to hold. It was the kind of truth that cannot be unfelt once it has been felt, the specific discomfort of a clear-eyed description of the gap between who you were and who you were trying to become, delivered not as criticism, but as observation, which was somehow more demanding than criticism, because it required no defense and no argument and simply sat there, asking to be honestly received. He received it honestly. There was a vehicle coming along the perimeter road, the car that would take her wherever she was going, arriving on its schedule, indifferent to the specifics of the conversation beside which it was pulling up. She watched it approach. She turned back to him once briefly and said the last thing she said to him. Your file says you're one of the best in your class. The file is probably right. She paused. The file is also about who you've been. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had been looking at him with complete accuracy from the beginning. What you're asking yourself right now, that's about who you're going to be. The vehicle stopped at the building. She picked up her bag and walked toward it with the same quality of movement she had walked into and out of the mess hall, with the movement of someone whose relationship to the room they are leaving is complete and requires no backward look. She did not look back. He stood and watched the vehicle move down the perimeter road. When it cleared the last building and disappeared from view, he stood for another moment in the November morning, and then he walked back toward the main base. He passed the mess hall. He stopped. He went inside. The mess hall at 0610 was a different room than the mess hall at noon. Quieter, the fluorescent lights bright over the empty tables. The smell of coffee in progress in the first preparations of the morning meal moving from the kitchen. A couple of early risers at the near table. The long center table empty. The far corner still. Table 7, chair pushed neatly in, wall solid on 3 sides, sightline clear to the main door. The particular geometry of a position chosen by someone who had learned long before she arrived here that the work mattered more than who was watching you do it. He stood beside it for a moment, not sitting down, not making it into something ceremonial, just standing beside it the way you stand beside something you are trying to understand by proximity, by staying close to it long enough that the understanding comes on its own in its own time without being forced. Then he walked to the center table and sat down in his usual seat, and waited for the morning to fully arrive. Roy Griffith came in at 0630, as he did every morning's coffee already in hand, face carrying the ordinary expression of a man at the beginning of a day he intends to navigate with deliberate efficiency. He saw Beckett. He sat down at the other end of the table, his end back to the wall, the position he always chose. He looked at Beckett once, the long measuring look that took things in without commenting on them. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between them. It was a coin, worn smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from years of being handled, carried in a pocket, and turned over in a hand, set down and picked back up. The engraving on it was still visible, but softened by use. Beckett looked at it without touching it. He had seen coins like this before. Challenge coins, the military tradition of small metal tokens given to mark service in a specific unit, a specific operation, a specific moment that the people who were there would understand and everyone else would not. This one he did not recognize. Griffith looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "She gave it to me, in the building. After she said move and we moved. She pressed it into my hand before she went back out the door." He paused. I asked her later what unit it was from. She said it wasn't a unit. He picked the coin back up, held it for a moment. She said it was from the first operation she ever ran alone, her first command decision. Age 22. He looked at it. She said she carried it to remember what it felt like before she knew what it would cost. He set it back in his pocket. Beckett said nothing. Griffith looked at the empty far table. Something moved across his face, not grief, not exactly, but the closest thing to it that a man of his particular formation allowed to show. "I've been carrying it 5 years," he said quietly, waiting to give it back. He looked at Beckett. She didn't take it this morning. The mess hall filled up around them in the ordinary way. Trays, voices, boots on concrete, the accumulated noise of a Thursday morning that was not the same Wednesday as the one before it and would never be. The center table filled with the team with conversation with the particular warmth of men starting a day together. No one sat at table 7, not that morning, not the one after it, not for the rest of the week, not by formal decision, not by announcement, simply by the wordless agreement of a room that had learned something and was in the small available ways showing that it had learned it. Beckett looked at the far table once from across the room, the chair pushed in, the wall behind it, the clear line to the door. Then he turned back to his food and his team and the day that was organizing itself in front of him. He thought about what Griffith had just told him, about a 22-year-old woman pressing a coin into the hand of a man she was leading out of a building in the dark to remember what it felt like before she knew what it would cost. About carrying that coin for 5 years and not being able to give it back. About the specific weight of gratitude that has no proper address that you carry not because you chose to, but because there is no other place to put it. He thought about 17 years of sitting with your back to the wall, not as a posture chosen in any given room, but as the accumulated result of long enough exposure to rooms where the wrong position was the last position. The way that kind of learning does not leave when you leave the room. The way it becomes the permanent shape of how you occupy space, any space, because the body remembers what the mind tries to categorize. He thought about a photograph face down on a desk, about the arrangement made with it present but not in front of her. Some things carried behind rather than in the hands. He was 26 years old. He was at the beginning of an actual question. He did not know yet what the question cost. He suspected the cost was not paid all at once, not in a single dramatic moment of reckoning, but in the accumulated weight of small choices that turned out on reflection to be the large ones. The choice to stop performing and start paying attention. The choice to stay in the discomfort of honest accounting rather than reaching for the nearest exit from it. The choice made daily and without ceremony to do the work for the work. Those choices did not announce themselves. They did not arrive with the drama of the moment in the mess hall. No admiral walking through the door, no room going silent, no public correction. They arrived in quiet in the ordinary operations of a day in the moments between the visible ones. He understood that this was where most of the real work happened, not in the moments people watched, in the ones they didn't. Griffith finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at Beckett from the end of the table with the long practiced look of a man who has said what needed to be said and is now simply present. He did not offer anything further. He did not tie it up. He sat with the comfortable silence of someone who trusts the person across from him to do the necessary work in their own time, and who knows that the best thing you can do for that process is not to interrupt it. Beckett met his eyes. Then he nodded. It was a small nod, The kind that does not require explanation because the person it is directed at already understands exactly what it means. The kind that passes between two people when language has reached its limit and what remains is simpler and more durable than language. Griffith nodded back. Outside, the November sun was doing what it did over the Pacific. The base moved through a morning. Personnel went where they were going. The machinery of readiness turned over and kept turning, the same machinery that had been turning on this strip of land for decades, that would keep turning after every person currently within its grounds had moved on to wherever they were going. The Pacific moved the way it always moves, not for the base, not for the SEALs, not for the woman who had passed through and left the room changed behind her. Simply because that is what the Pacific does. It moves and it keeps moving, and it does not require anyone's acknowledgement to do it. Commander Maricol was in a vehicle heading north on the I-5 toward whatever came next, the bag in the seat beside her, the documents she needed, the work that did not stop. In her jacket pocket against her left side, there was no coin. She had made a decision this morning that she had been making and unmaking for 5 years, and this time standing in the early gray outside an administrative building, while a young sergeant who had asked her rank 3 days ago stood in front of her with his actual face on, she had finally made it clean. She had left it where it belonged. Some things you carry until the right moment to set them down makes itself clear. You cannot force that moment. You cannot schedule it or decide it in advance. You simply carry and you do the next right thing, and eventually the moment comes. The I-5 ran north along the coast. The ocean was visible in flashes between the developments, silver in the morning light, moving at its own enormous scale. She looked at it through the window for a moment. Then she looked at the road ahead. There is a kind of person the world produces rarely and needs constantly, someone who has been through enough and carried enough and done the necessary work of becoming exactly themselves, such that when they walk into a room, the room changes. Not because they announce themselves, not because they require recognition, simply because the quality of what they bring is real in a way that makes everything performed in that room suddenly visible by contrast. Most people will encounter one or two of these people in a lifetime if they are paying attention. If they are not paying attention, they might encounter one and ask what her rank is, and spend the rest of their life learning to understand the answer. That is not a punishment. That is an education. And the mess hall at Naval Base Coronado on a Wednesday in November was for the people in it who were ready to receive it exactly that. Table 7 sat empty against the far wall. It would stay empty for the rest of the week. Outside, the Pacific moved the way it always moves. It did not need anyone to watch.